next decade rolls in. I have just a couple of double-click questions, and I hope we're getting questions from the audience because we'd love to have them. But I just want to double-click on 2 points that you've raised. You know, you've talked about federalism. Now, a state in India, like Tamil Nadu, is the size of a large European country. There are states in India which are the size of a continent also in terms of population. 200 million. And yet, this is a country where we do not have municipal or municipality level democracy. We do not have district level democracy. We don't have panchayat level democracy. I understand that a panchayat president and vice president jointly are allowed to sign a check for 100 rupees or 200 rupees. So the administrative officers appointed by the state government are ruling all the way. Tell me, if I'm living in this area or any other area, I have a house in Tiruvannamalai, I reflect a lot there in terms of how it's being administered. Can any of the changes that you're talking about happen if the districts and municipalities and villages do not have an elected government and instead you parachute in somebody from some other part of the country who has a 24-month stint? Without that, can any of these changes happen? Should this be a fifth pillar? Rajiv Gandhi tried, and in 1989, the 64th amendment he tried, and he lost with 400 seat majority in parliament. Yeah. Of course, he did do the 73rd, but that was not a bit diluted compared to the original one. What are your thoughts on how do we reform the grassroots and bring in a third level of democracy in this country?
I think this is a phenomenal question, Gopal. I really like that question. Let me share, yesterday when I was actually, when I was trying to rush to your home, and so I was actually coming from Kanchipuram. I was about an hour away, and I see that we are about 30 kilometers away. 30 kilometers away, and Google Maps is showing me that it's going to take me 1 hour to travel 30 kilometers, actually even less than 30 kilometers, about 26, 27 kilometers. And I was just quickly comparing, because for the last close to 2 years, I live in the United States. I was thinking that to travel 20 kilometers, in the United States, I would do that. That's about 15 miles. I would do it basically in, about 20 minutes. Now, the question so automatically came to my mind, how do we get state governments to actually become responsible? And I was wondering, why is it that our pace is so slow? Because there are roads, actually some parts of the road are shambolic. Absolutely shambolic. So the thought that came to my mind is, why don't we start tracking and using Google data? It is possible now to see what is the average speed, among all the major cities, and thereby put state governments, or at the same time, also put the average speeds in other international cities and say, hey, and now this is my response to your question, because social media gives us that democratization. Why shouldn't basically, we get the data from Google Maps, say in Chennai, for instance, the average pace is basically, and that is reflective of the quality of the roads, the average pace is maybe just 20 kilometers per hour, while, maybe, and maybe Bangalore is just 15 kilometers per hour. Mumbai maybe is not very different, 20 kilometers, put that out. And also put out basically saying, for every politician who talks about, I'll make this city a Singapore, or I'll make that city a, Copenhagen or whatever, put that data, and this is something of the state government. Contracts for basically road construction, local road construction, and this is not NHAI doing it.
Subba, I just want to interrupt here. Just like everybody looks to the PM and says you should do something, change. Here we look at the CM. Mm-hmm. But for example, many of these roads are within the Madras Corporation limits.
Yep.
And yet the mayor doesn't exist, has no power. Now if the mayor was aware, he would probably be able to spend time on this issue. And that is my question. The mayors of South Korea and Taiwan and China have become the heads of politburos and prime ministers.
Yes.
Today the mayor of Chennai is not shall we say, an upward mobile job.
Yeah. No, I think that is I'm conceding that, Gopal. What I'm actually, this is a question that would be far better answered by a politician, because they would know, I would like to ask the chief ministers themselves that why are you not willing to delegate power to your
Absolutely.
lower down? That's
from
a question.
The SFCs.
I am not in a position to answer that question, But what I can still say is there is, even if that does not happen, we still can actually, as citizens, put pressure to ensure that, in my opinion, if basically this becomes an important issue that, matters in the elections, I don't know how many MLA constituencies there are in Chennai. If all the citizens start saying basically that, our vote depends on how fast we're able to travel, why should we have for us to travel 30 kilometers to work, why should we have to spend 2 hours? It basically, if you reduce it to 30 minutes, I get to spend basically, 1.5 plus 1.5, 3 hours with my family. I can spend 3 hours with my family. My vote depends on that. Don't you think even, with the current status itself, without the mayor, don't you think that will be an important issue? In my opinion, yes. And that is what social media gives us the power to. So, in other words, this is important especially and the reason I highlight this, Gopal, is that we, if we have to get brains back from many of the, absolutely, the quality of living in our metros needs to go up. And one of the most important determinants of quality of living, in our metros is just the travel time. Another idea, why can't we have staggered work, for instance? Now, post-COVID, we have actually online meetings. So some offices start at 6 o'clock in the morning, some others start at 10 o'clock in the morning, then some others start at 2 o'clock and some others start at 6. So that everybody is not basically, going to office at the same time, and then you're basically getting clogging at 8 o'clock and in the morning and 6 o'clock these are ideas, I think, which can definitely be done. What requires is some changes in the relevant act. And I'm sure the bureaucrats basically, if we put pressure, in my opinion, I think in the urban areas, travel time has to become an important election issue. Because every minute that we save in travel time is time that we can spend with our families. And
your next stop is in Bangalore, right?
Yes. I'm dreading that. I'm really dreading that.
There are a lot of excellent questions, and I'm just going to combine a few of them from the audience. In your book, a lot of examples of comparison, should I say, from China. And also in our normal business narratives and discourse, we often say, I went to China, it's like this, I went to China, it's like that. Very, very common in our own internal conversations, right? But I'm just thinking about the fact that whether really we should think of this country more in the scale of China, or we should think of it more in the manner of Brazil. Brazil, like us, noisy democracy, lots of changes. China went on and on and on, but Brazil basically completely got stuck in the middle income trap, which we all know about. Here also in India, we find very strong distortions in wealth. I think the top 3 individuals in India are more wealthier than the GDP of Singapore, is what I saw in the paper today. The Oxfam reports galore about 1% and of the people owning all the wealth and so on is there. So isn't there a danger that in this growth, because of our democratic structures, there will not be a continuity of policies and we'll actually end up more like Brazil rather than China?
I think that's a good question, Gopal, and this is something that I anticipated, and therefore there's a chapter on the middle income trap. And I think the example that you gave of Brazil is very apt because when you look at countries that have been stuck in the middle income trap, it is mostly the Latin American countries. There are important lessons there. In contrast, countries, not just China, and I think we don't need to restrict ourselves to China. If you look at many of the East Asian economies have been able to grow their GDP per capita significantly and not be stuck in the middle income trap. There are important lessons there, and I think, of course, the importance of the political establishment realizing the importance of reforms and us citizens also highlighting the importance of reforms at the state level, I think I cannot overemphasize. That said, though, from the economic perspective, leave the political aspects aside for other experts to opine on. On the economic aspects, there are important lessons. When we look at countries that have been stuck in the middle income trap, these are countries that could not graduate from their earlier model. If you look at any of the Latin American countries, these primarily, they were, they use a lot of primary activities, which is actually, which is sort of, let's say, using raw materials, exporting, not as much of some secondary, but, not as much tertiary either. And those models, so though the elite that benefited from those, from pursuing business models, in those, they ended up becoming very powerful and thereby inhibiting change when the country wanted to move on and therefore reduce or take away whatever support they had provided to industry in order for such growth to happen. These vested interests actually block because, that this is something that will hurt them. And I think there's a very important lesson in there for India, which is that we have to take, for instance, the PLI scheme, and it was introduced, I was part of the government when it was introduced. But any support scheme should continue for a while, but it should not be ad infinitum. I think that is important. Because support should be provided to children. Support should not be provided to dwarfs. We, as parents as well, think about it. I want to give you this example. Let's say us as children, or maybe think about our own children. If basically the child knows that even when the child is 40-year-old, we're going to support them economically, will that child ever make the effort to study and become self-efficient? No. So implicit in, what do? We basically have the expectation is that by equipping yourself, you will become self-sufficient. It's like, think about when a child is learning to cycle, we provide them the training wheels. If the child knows that the training wheels are going to be there all the time, they will not learn to, cycle properly. The child knows that those training wheels are going to be taken away. Similarly, with support as well, economic support, till the child grows to become an adult, it should be there. But if the industry knows that this is there forever, they will not invest in becoming more capable. It's a very important lesson in it, because this is what has made the Latin American economies stuck. The industry that benefited from these policies, they became a powerful interest and thereby inhibited and wanted to protect their turf, did not allow, subsequent reforms to happen, a risk that we have to be aware of. Similarly, when it comes to actually, I think judicial reforms are important because rule of law enforcement is an important aspect. There's a literature that actually shows both the necessary and sufficient conditions to avoid the middle income trap. The sufficient conditions are the combination of these three, which is manufacturing sector growth, which is another secondary sector, productivity increase, and rule of law. These are the three that are sufficient for a country to avoid the middle income trap. India needs to be definitely aware of that.
That's great. I think there is a stark difference, as you pointed out, between the natural resource type of Brazil and a kind of more service industry, knowledge industry, manufacturing like in India. Is absolutely fantastic point. I just want to combine again a few questions. There's a lot of concern in the audience, and I'll take three of their questions. One is, how do we actually make sure that young people in India are motivated to fight the good fight? My mentor C.K. Prahalad always said, entrepreneurs are the nation's freedom fighters for social and economic freedom.
Yes.
But the word fighter, Kshatriyatvam, is a very important word. Not everybody is born a Kshatriya in their heart and mind.
Yeah.
So how do we create the kind of resilience and strength in people to want to be an entrepreneur and to have the thrills and spills of being one entrepreneur? The other question is also about, do the labor laws, the kind of laws around venture capital funding in India, where PF, for example, is not allowed to invest in venture capital funds, really set of enabling laws encourage such entrepreneurship? Do we need reforms in labor laws? Do we need reforms in pension fund laws? And the third question, I think, is also around the fact that everybody is going to college, and there are lots of wonderful college kids here asking some really smart questions. And they're all worried that what they're being taught in college is something that was created by, old men and maybe women as well. But right now there's AI, there is this whole talk about global workforce that is fungible, there is talk about cyber security and threats, there's robotics, there is gene editing, there is synthetic biology. How are we actually equipping this generation to live up to the expectations you set in the book?
I think, Great question. Let me take your last question first, because this relates to youngsters. And, I'm myself an academic, and a teacher. But let me reflect on myself as a student. Let me not reflect as a teacher, but as a student. When I think back to what is it that, that education gave me two things really. One was the ability to think independently, which is, and without blinkers. And in some sense, this is what I really got from the education, which is that realizing that even someone like a Wasim Akram can bowl full tosses. In other words, just because a Nobel laureate had said something doesn't mean it is right. I have to, given my education, given my training, I have to understand it and then see whether it basically is correct or not. So that independent thinking, is something that education taught me. Second, which is in some sense related, is the ability to think ab initio. Ab initio is a Latin word, which is basically to think from first principles. I'll give you an example. When COVID happened, for instance, what we had learned, all of us had learned, in grad school and in business school. When I say grad school, I mean PhD. Is that a crisis is something that reduces demand because people's earnings are affected. But I remember actually, agonizing around March, April 2020. For a while, and many times I distinctly remember getting up at maybe 2 o'clock in the night, thinking, what is this crisis about? And sometimes, maybe 50, 60 seconds, there will be some worry. Then I'd say, let me go and read. About 2-3 weeks, basically, it took me time to understand that it's going to be a big supply side shock. Now, at the level of economics, demand and supply are fundamental elements. So the ability to, in some sense, not use blinkers just because in the textbook theory told us, just because previous researchers said that every crisis is a crisis to demand, not taking that at face value. Saying that if, for instance, this is the first time in a crisis, governments are asking people to stay back home. People are locking down the economy. That has to mean something. That doubt in my mind, I think that doubt is also important. In some sense, I think what I want to say is that education should also make you aware of your ignorance. Why am I saying this? Because, you and others may be thinking, the question was about artificial intelligence and what is this prof responding? If you're thinking along those lines, let me connect the dots. Not only artificial intelligence, but in the next 25 years, there'll be some other new things that will come. When you learn how to learn, then when new things come, you can learn. And the fundamental building blocks to learning how to learn is the ability to think ab initio, is the ability to remove blinkers, and more importantly, the belief that just because this is new, I don't have to be ignorant about it, I can go and learn it. That is what an education is supposed to provide. I think it's important to understand the difference between education and training. You get trained to do AI. You get trained to maybe, use a typewriting machine. You get trained to maybe go and operate the lathe machine. That's different from, education. I think this is a fundamental aspect we have to understand, and I'm saying this by reflecting as a student. The tools that give you the ability to learn all through your life, that is what an education provides. And that is what, if you are lifelong learners, there will be new things that will keep coming. We'll continue learning.
What about the resilience and entrepreneurship?
Yes, I think that's are
we all getting very comfortable with social media and being the world's largest YouTube watchers and Instagram reelers?
So in general, a general point I want to say, whenever we talk about any statistic about India, please make sure that you normalize it by the population or you normalize it by the GDP. For instance, there were, during the election time, there were these, things that the debt is this much in rupee terms. Do a simple thing, normalize it by the level of the GDP. People say, there are so many people, who are leaving for other countries. We are a 1.4 billion population. Normalize it by the population. I think this is something, absolute numbers in and itself, without normalizing by population, are meaningless. That's the first thing too. So if we have, largest YouTube population basically seeing YouTube, it's also the case that we have the largest population too. So do we have as a percentage terms? I think that's a question to ask. Let's say, suppose that as a proportion of population also, let's suppose we have the largest. If that is the case, let me still respond to the question. I think what is important is, see, every powerful tool can actually be used for constructive purposes, can also be used for destructive purposes. Take something like fire. If we don't light a fire, we cannot have food. But the same fire can be used for arson as well. And one can keep giving examples like this of all innovations. I think the people who basically are, I'll go back to today, for instance, is social media. When I was growing up, I know my father used to be really worried about the corrupting influence that television might have. I'll share a story. This has to, even if, I'm sort of stretching time a little bit, have to share this story. Me and my brother, we actually used to watch cricket. So, around exam time also, we never wanted to miss a game. So what we used to do, our father's office was very close by. So, he could walk, actually, it was just a 5-minute walk. So the deal that between me and my brother was that, 5 overs, I will sit and watch, without getting interrupted. He will be sitting at the door, where he's seeing whether Appa is coming or not. And then after 5 overs, we will basically interchange. And, we used to start out basically with this deal, but as soon as 10 overs was bowled, we forgot about the deal. Both of us would be watching. On one occasion, we were not lucky, and we see actually both of us are, staring into the television, and there is our father standing there. I don't remember, I must have been close to, doing natural phenomena stuff at that time. So, but I remember my father saying...
But the question is also more on, do they have the steel backbones and the fiery ambition?
I'm coming to that actually too. So my father at that time basically said that, TV odachidu poren. Venda. The venda. In other words, these tools and more tools will come. What we need to really make our kids appreciate is there is no other formula in life that I have or you have or any one of the successful people that I've discovered here is hard work. If anybody thinks that you basically can learn or you can achieve stuff without working hard, I think they're actually having a pipe dream. That's the first thing to emphasize. Most important. And that formula never changes. Whatever the new, whatever new thing comes. Second, the importance of resilience, which is actually, and I don't know how many of you got a chance when the Indian, when India won the World Cup. I wrote a piece in the Times of India and talked about the importance of learning from failures. And I think, I can tell you, if there is a person in this room who actually can raise their hand and say that they've not failed, either they are God or they're lying. It's an important aspect of life. And I think, just to give an example, yesterday my son was he's trying to implement, he's a first year student, doing computer science. He's trying to implement an, AI model. And the model was not, he said, it's not working at all. Appa, it's doing stupid things. He seemed really frustrated. I told him, this is what this is the point of the internship you're doing. You want to learn how to deal with the failure. And I think this is a really important part that, we need to tell our kids to be able to deal with failure. Failure is just an event. we need to learn from that. I think that's what builds a lot of resilience. In other words, the fundamental virtues that, or old-fashioned virtues, the environment can change, but these virtues remain as germane. And actually, I'm saying, of course, based on many of our personal experience, mine as well, but Gary Becker, the Nobel laureate, in economics in 1992, has written research papers on this, showing that old-fashioned virtues actually, whether it was for my father's generation or my grandfather's generation or my generation or my kids' generation or our grandkids' generation, these old-fashioned virtues will remain important. It is basically the tools will change, but these virtues, we need to keep running them again and again. I'm sure, Gopal, your son basically goes to IIT. So I don't think I can, some of your skills you should put out basically how did you manage to basically, competition is intense. I'm sure he dealt with when he would have been going for coaching, he would have dealt with a few failures himself. So these are the important things that really we need to be teaching our kids. That if you're going to be just seeing YouTube, then when exams come, the exam marks come, obviously you're going to be disappointed. In some sense, the aspect of, delayed gratification. Delayed gratification. That is really important, to be able to instill into our kids and generation. And I think all of us, especially, without appearing like tatas, basically giving, we have to try and, inculcate these aspects in the kids.
My father told me when I was very young that if at least 100 Indians are not better because of me, I have completely failed in my life. And that sort of stuck with me. I just want to ask a question. There's an old saying, right, that criticism is like the rainwater that stays on the leaves of the tree. It slowly drips to the bottom and nurtures the tree when the rain has stopped.
Yep.
So in that spirit, somebody is asking a question about you. During peak COVID time, economists were shouting from rooftops that when the Western world was spending a big percentage of the GDP as relief package, you were stingy and that would take India deep into trouble. But you are very confident of how you are handling it and proved later to be correct. So there is in some sense a criticism and then there is a praise. Where did that optimism come to you in the midst of such an overwhelming catastrophe that was happening in the middle of the COVID era?
Thanks for that question. It gets me emotional. If ever I write my autobiography, the first chapter will be this. I remember, on the 31st of August of 2020, I, gave an interview to Rajdeep Sardesai. And Rajdeep, remember this was the time, so this was the lockdown quarter. GDP had declined by 24%. And as Gopal and, whoever asked this question certainly would remember, the eagles were out, especially in the media. So he says, historic decline in the GDP, and blah, blah. And then I said, there's a V-shaped recovery. What was behind that? So, couple of things. One, as you would recall when I took over as the chief economic advisor in December of 2018, growth was declining. And there were a lot of narratives actually at that time, including some who, who at that time were part of the Economic Advisory Council of the Prime Minister, who said India is stuck in a middle income trap. That is why growth is basically declining. There were others who actually said other policy measures that led to, but what I was convinced about was this growth decline was only because of the crony lending that we had done and the overhang of that. I was absolutely convinced there was nothing structurally wrong with the Indian economy. Because, we had implemented policies just then. A few years back, we had implemented the IBC. There was the RERA that was implemented. Lots of reforms had been done. The financial inclusion program of more than 500 million people had been done. There was basically a cleanliness program that was being done. We had covered in the economic survey as well how that was improving health outcomes. So seeing all this, and so I was not persuaded at all. And in many of my early interviews, even before COVID, I said there's nothing structurally wrong with the Indian economy. Many people didn't believe at that time, but I was absolutely convinced. This was one element. Second, and this is something, as soon as lockdown happened, what we did was, and a lot of credit goes to a phenomenal team that we had of young, assistant directors and deputy directors. These are Indian Economic Service officers in the Ministry of Finance. I took a lot of care to create this team that was called Team CEA. On a side note, the deal to them was that, even the advisors or senior advisors who are joint secretary, additional secretary level people will need appointment to come and meet me, but you can walk into my room. But on the flip side, I can call you at 2:30 in the night as well, I might have work. That was the deal that I struck with this team, but so it was a phenomenal team. This team, of course, I thought it is important. So I asked them to go and start tracking about 60 high frequency indicators on a weekly basis. And what we used to do was, starting from the lockdown itself, on Monday morning, we would see what was the level of the indicator last week, what was the level of the indicator this week, what's the change. And we would share that with the Honorable Prime Minister, the Honorable Finance Minister, and many of the senior cabinet ministers, so that we were tracking the economy not after a couple of months, but every week. And this data, putting this data together really helped, together with my assessment of the economy. So what I was seeing was, yes, during the lockdown, many of these indicators, e-way bills, power consumption, many of those were basically first trending down, but they started trending up as well as the lockdown was removed. And so I was actually seeing the V in the data at that time because of these, high frequency indicators, the 60 high frequency indicators, combined with the belief that there was nothing structurally wrong with the economy, that the 24% decline was only because we had restrained economic activity by doing the lockdown. Then I said, okay, as the restrictions on economic activity are taken out, obviously, the GDP will come back. And that's what led to the V-shaped recovery. It was, I will tell you, after having talked about the V-shaped recovery, one of the other questions then Rajdeep comes up with he said something to the effect of, famous economists like XYZ are saying that this government does not know how to handle the economy, etc., etc. I responded by saying, by the way, one can prepare for economic questions, but one cannot prepare for ad hominem attacks like these. So you have to respond on the fly. And this is on on live. So I said, Rajdeep, you're a fan of cricket, so am I. So I'll give you a parallel. Sachin Tendulkar, Shane Warne and Wasim Akram were great bowlers, but even they bowled full tosses. I'll leave it at that. So
well put.
It was a very difficult period. I think the lesson that it also helps. The other, I think, let me share some private thoughts that I had at that time. Was I 100% confident about a V-shaped recovery? No. I can say I was maybe 75%, 80% confident of a V-shaped recovery. It would be a lie if I say I was 100% confident, because during a time, and especially when everybody is saying, and people are saying, things that are very negative, you also try to incorporate, and I was not 100% confident. But I also, this is the third thought that went into my mind, which was that when an individual is down, it is very easy to kick. That doesn't require any leadership to do that. But when an individual is down, to actually pick that individual up and say, saying, no, you can do it, that is actually what displays leadership. And given the vantage point at which I was at that point in time, I said, even with the cost of tomorrow, let's say, if the V-shaped recovery doesn't happen, obviously there'll be egg on my face. But I said, at this point in time, it is my responsibility to display that leadership, that I am not going to kick. I will basically, go and build spirits. So, of course, credibly with data, but at the same time, this was a sentiment that eventually...
And before I ask my last question, which is, I think, the complete unanimous question from everybody in the audience telepathically transmitted to me. I want to just thank everybody for their questions. I think we haven't answered all the questions, but great questions, especially from the young students. Do read the book. I have been able to glean some of the knowledge of the book, and I'll tell you my secret how I did that. So you will find many of the answers. I flipped through the book. In fact, saw most of the infographics, which is what I still like reading comics, so I read infographics first. But the quality of the infographics, the quality of the insights, the organization of the chapters is phenomenal. So you will find this answers to your questions and much, much more when you read the book. And now to the last question, which has been telepathically sent to me by the audience. Have you received a call from the Prime Minister's office, and what's next for you?
I'm so inclined to say that with friends like you, I don't need any enemies. But let me, honestly, Gopal, see, given the kind of background that I come from, what gives me the maximum satisfaction and which is what, I do it passionately, is actually to serve the nation.
I think that one line says it all, Subbu.
Thank you very much.
I must also thank my colleague Mani, who helped me to put this together. Thank you, Mani.
Thank you. Thank you. I think one of the finest lectures we had for a very, very long time. A big round of applause to, and especially what he said about son and father. In today's thing, in a later moment, is the father must be waiting for son not to come back, because the son comes back, they throw him away and start watching Netflix actually. But today is different, and we have over 980 viewers watching it online. Thank you for so many questions. Unfortunately, you read the book and many questions have already been answered. Now I request Mali to please come onto the stage and present a moment on behalf of MMA. May I also request, we are going to give a copy of the book. I got few copies from Rupa. Thanks to Rupa Publication and also ISB. Please come. I request the committee members to come and pick up the copy so that the author will agree to sign. Mali, please. One book read, one English, and a book release the you can pick up a copy complimentary from MMA. I got few copies. First come, first served. Please, the author is kindly agreed to sign all the copies and look forward to seeing you.
Thank you. But your hand is so beautiful. You have learned from your.
All the questions come. I sent 2050.